By the time the sun rose, he was supposed to be dead. That was the certainty shared by both armies on that frozen stretch of land. The battle had ended hours earlier, leaving the forest torn apart by artillery, the ground soaked in blood, and the air heavy with smoke and silence. No one expected movement there again. Anyone still alive was either captured or finished off before dawn. Somewhere beyond the shattered tree line, a single man lay motionless. His uniform was soaked through, stiff from the cold and dark with blood that wasn't all his. One leg refused to respond. His hands shook uncontrollably, not just from pain, but from the cold that crept deeper into his bones with every passing minute. Each breath felt louder than it should have been, like the night itself was listening. He had no radio, no map, no idea where the enemy line truly began or ended. All around him, the sounds of war hadn't disappeared, they had merely changed. Boots crunching on frozen leaves, low voices speaking a language he understood just enough to fear, a distant metallic click, the unmistakable sound of a rifle being checked. If he stayed where he was, morning would expose him. If he moved, even a single mistake would give him away. He knew the truth that few soldiers ever have time to fully grasp. Survival was no longer about orders, strategy, or victory. It was about minutes, about silence, about enduring pain quietly enough to remain invisible. Somewhere behind enemy lines, with the night closing in and death actively searching for him, this soldier made a decision that would defy everything military logic said was possible. By all accounts, he should not have lived to see the sun rise, but he did. And what happened during those hours in the dark would become one of the most harrowing survival stories of the Second World War. Stories like this rarely make it into history books. They happen in the spaces between official reports, in the moments where no one is watching, no medals are being awarded, and survival depends entirely on the human will to endure the impossible. Today's story is one of those moments. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. These are real stories of war, survival, and human resilience. Told without exaggeration, but without holding anything back. And as you listen, I'd love to know, what city and country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. Now let's go back to the night, when this soldier found himself wounded, alone, and trapped deep inside enemy territory, with no expectation of rescue and no guarantee that he would survive until morning. The operation was supposed to be simple, at least simple by the brutal standards of World War II. His unit had been advancing through contested territory for days, pushing forward yard by yard, clearing forests and abandoned villages that no longer belonged to anyone. The maps they carried were already outdated, the front lines shifting faster than ink could dry on paper. By late afternoon, the order came down: advance and secure the area before nightfall. What they didn't know was that the enemy had already anticipated their movement. The first explosion hit without warning. The ground erupted just ahead of the column, throwing dirt, snow, and shattered branches into the air. Men dove for cover as the sound of incoming artillery followed. Not one shell, but many. The forest that had seemed silent seconds earlier became a chaos of fire, screaming metal, and panic. He remembered being thrown backward by the blast, the air knocked clean out of his lungs. His helmet flew off somewhere into the darkness. When he tried to stand, his leg buckled beneath him, pain flaring so sharply it blurred his vision. Around him, the unit was breaking apart. Shouts overlapped, orders were given and lost instantly in the thunder of explosions. Smoke swallowed the trees, reducing visibility to just a few feet. In that confusion, survival instincts took over. Men ran, some forward, some back, some straight into enemy fire. He crawled. Every movement sent pain through his body, but staying still felt worse. Somewhere nearby, machine gun fire tore through the underbrush. He pressed his face into the frozen earth, tasting dirt and metal, waiting for the next burst to pass. Minutes felt like hours. When the firing finally slowed, the forest fell into an unnatural silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows devastation. He called out softly. No answer. He called again, louder this time. Still nothing. Slowly he realized what had happened. The unit had pulled back, or been wiped out. Either way, he was alone. As darkness fully settled in, another realization set in, one that made his stomach tighten with fear. Based on the direction of the retreat, the sounds he now heard, and the distant movement of shadows between the trees, he wasn't just separated from his unit, he was behind enemy lines, and the enemy was still out there, searching the battlefield, finishing the wounded, taking prisoners, and ensuring that no one who shouldn't survive did. Clenching his teeth, he dragged himself deeper into the forest, knowing that every second mattered, and that by morning the world would either find his body or never know how close he had come to dying there. The cold arrived before the fear fully settled in. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped fast, faster than his body could adapt. His uniform, damp with sweat and blood, stiffened against his skin. Every breath burned his lungs, the air slicing into him like glass. He understood something critical in that moment. If he stopped moving for too long, the cold would finish what the battle had started. But movement carried its own deadly risk. Not far from his position, voices drifted through the trees, low, calm, confident. The sound of men who believed the fight was already over. He recognized the rhythm of their speech, even when he couldn't make out the words. Enemy patrols. They were sweeping the battlefield. This wasn't random. It was methodical. They moved in small groups, stopping often, checking bodies, listening. A wounded soldier crying out would be found quickly. A careless movement would draw attention. He forced himself to slow his breathing, inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth, as quietly as possible. He pressed his body into a shallow depression between the roots of a fallen tree, pulling loose branches and snow over himself. It wasn't real cover, just enough to break up his outline in the darkness. Moments later, boots passed close enough that he could see their silhouettes. One of the soldiers laughed. Another kicked something on the ground, likely a fallen weapon or helmet. They spoke briefly, then moved on. He didn't move. Minutes stretched into an hour. Pain radiated from his leg in waves, each one sharper than the last. He suspected a fracture, maybe shrapnel still buried deep. His hands had gone numb, fingers stiff and unresponsive. When he tried to flex them, they barely obeyed. Still he waited. Only when the sounds faded completely did he begin to crawl again. Every inch forward was calculated. He avoided open ground, sticking to shadows and natural cover. When he reached a small rise, he froze. Lights flickered ahead, faint but unmistakable. An enemy position. That realization crushed any remaining illusion of safety. There would be no easy route back, no quick escape. Every direction now carried danger. He had to think differently. Instead of trying to move toward friendly lines, which he could no longer locate with certainty, he focused on one objective: stay alive until daylight without being discovered. That meant shelter. He scanned the darkness until he spotted it. A shallow shell crater partially collapsed on one side. It wasn't ideal. If patrols passed too close, he'd be trapped. But it offered something critical: protection from wind. Dragging himself inside took every ounce of strength he had left. Once inside, he curled his body inward, minimizing his exposed surface. He wrapped his arms around his torso, pressing his chin to his chest, trying to preserve warmth. His teeth chattered uncontrollably. Time lost meaning. Pain blurred into exhaustion. Exhaustion drifted dangerously close to sleep. He knew better. Sleep in these conditions wasn't rest. It was surrender. To stay awake, he focused on small details. The sound of wind moving through broken branches. The distant rumble of artillery far beyond the forest. The slow rhythm of his own breathing. Then, something new cut through the night. A metallic scrape, Close, too close. He stiffened as a shadow appeared at the edge of the crater. A soldier stood there, silhouetted against the faint glow of distant fires. The man paused, peering down. His heart hammered so violently he was sure it could be heard. Seconds passed. The soldier shifted his weight, muttered something under his breath, and then moved on. Only after the footsteps faded did he realize he had been holding his breath. That was the moment the truth settled in completely. This wasn't just about surviving the cold or the pain anymore. The enemy was actively searching, and the night was far from over. At some point during the night, the silence changed. It wasn't quieter, it was sharper. The distant chaos of battle had faded, replaced by something more deliberate. Short bursts of movement, voices stopping and starting, patrols no longer sweeping randomly, but tightening their search. They knew someone was still out there. He felt it before he fully understood it. The way sound carried differently, the way shadows moved with purpose instead of chance. This was no longer cleanup after a battle. This was a hunt. Staying hidden was becoming more dangerous than moving. That realization terrified him. The crater that had saved him from the wind was now a trap. If a patrol decided to check it, he would have nowhere to go, no room to crawl away, no chance to run. And running wasn't an option anyway. His leg had swollen badly. Any pressure sent lightning through his body. He tore a strip of fabric from his uniform and tied it tight above the wound, not to stop bleeding. That had slowed hours ago, but to dull the pain just enough to function. He waited for the patrols to pass again. When they did, he counted steps, 1, 2, 3, until the sound faded. Only then did he force himself out of the crater, inch by painful inch. The forest looked different now. Darkness erased familiar shapes. Trees blended into walls. Every shadow looked like a man holding a rifle. He moved low, keeping his profile small, using his elbows and one good leg to drag himself forward. That was when he made the decision that would later save his life, and nearly cost it. Instead of avoiding enemy movement, he moved toward it. It made no sense on the surface, but the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Patrols followed predictable paths. They moved along terrain that allowed visibility and coordination. The safest place was where they least expected him to be, closer, near their lines. He angled his movement toward a shallow ravine that ran parallel to the sounds of enemy voices. The ground there was uneven, littered with debris from earlier bombardment. Dangerous to navigate, but also easy to overlook. Each movement felt louder than it should have been, the scrape of fabric, the snap of a frozen twig. He paused constantly, listening, heart pounding. At one point, voices erupted directly ahead. He froze. 3 soldiers emerged from behind a cluster of trees, moving straight toward his position. He had seconds. There was no time to retreat. He pressed himself flat against the earth, burying his face in mud and snow, pulling debris over his back. He forced his breathing into shallow, controlled pulls. The soldiers stopped. One of them shined a flashlight briefly across the ground. The beam passed inches from his head. He didn't blink, didn't move. Another soldier complained about the cold. They lingered longer than he thought possible. Then finally they moved on. Only when they were gone did he allow himself a single breath deeper than the rest. That close call changed everything. From that moment on, he understood the margin for error was gone. One mistake, one uncontrolled sound, one wrong movement would end it. Still, he kept going. Hours crawled by. His body screamed for rest. His hands were numb beyond pain. His vision blurred at the edges. More than once he caught himself drifting, his mind slipping toward sleep. Each time he forced himself awake by focusing on one thought: morning. If he could survive until first light, his chances would improve. Visibility would return. Patrols would thin. He could move with purpose instead of guesswork. But the night refused to end. Just when he thought the worst had passed, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Dogs, not one, several. Their distant barking cut through the forest, followed by shouted commands. Search dogs. The enemy wasn't just sweeping anymore, they were tracking. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. He forced it down, thinking fast. Dogs meant scent, which meant staying still was no longer an option. He dragged himself into the ravine, using the slope to mask his movement. At the lowest point, he pressed himself into a shallow stream of icy water. The shock was unbearable. Cold water seeped into his wounds, stealing his breath. His body convulsed violently, and he bit down hard on his sleeve to keep from crying out. He stayed there, half submerged, as long as he could. When he finally pulled himself out, his limbs barely responded, but the barking had shifted direction. The dogs had lost the trail. Barely alive, soaked and shaking uncontrollably, he crawled once more into the darkness, knowing that dawn was still hours away, and that survival would demand more from him than he believed he had left. The sky began to change almost imperceptibly. At first, it was nothing more than a thinning of the darkness, a faint suggestion that the night was losing its grip. The stars dimmed. The black between the trees softened into shades of deep grey. Dawn was coming. Under normal circumstances, daylight meant safety, visibility, orientation, a chance to move with intention instead of instinct. But here, trapped deep behind enemy lines, morning carried its own deadly risks. As light returned to the forest, concealment vanished. Every movement that had gone unnoticed in the dark would now be exposed. Every mistake would be final. He lay still beneath a tangle of broken branches, his body barely responding to commands anymore. The icy water had drained what little warmth he had left. His teeth no longer chattered, a dangerous sign. Hypothermia was setting in. He tried to flex his fingers. Nothing. Panic flared, sharp and sudden. If his hands failed completely, he would lose the ability to crawl, to grip, to defend himself if discovered. He forced himself to move anyway. Slowly, painfully, he dragged his body forward, inch by inch, toward a line of denser brush where shadows still clung. His vision swam. Shapes doubled and blurred. That was when he heard it. Engines, low at first, then louder, vehicles moving nearby. The enemy was mobilizing for daylight operations. Patrols were increasing, not decreasing. What had been small search teams in the night were now coordinated movements. He pressed himself flat as a truck passed on a nearby road, its tires crunching over frozen ground. Through gaps in the trees, he saw figures moving confidently, rifles slung, helmets silhouetted against the growing light. They believed the battlefield was secure. That belief was his only advantage. Using what little strength remained, he timed his movement carefully. He moved only when engines roared or voices rose, masking the sounds of his struggle. Each pause lasted longer than the last, as exhaustion dragged him closer to collapse. Then, something unexpected happened. A distant explosion thundered to the east. Artillery, not enemy fire, friendly fire. The sound sent a surge of adrenaline through his system. Friendly forces were still active, which meant the front line couldn't be far. He didn't know how far, only that it existed. Clinging to that hope, he altered his course, angling subtly toward the sound. Every step was agony. His leg felt unstable, the joint barely holding together. As the sun crested the horizon, shafts of pale light cut through the trees, illuminating the destruction left behind by the night. Bodies, craters, shattered equipment, and him. He froze as a voice called out nearby. Two soldiers stood less than 30 yards away, scanning the area. One raised binoculars. He pressed himself against a fallen log, heart racing, breath shallow. The log offered little cover, but its shadow broke his outline. Seconds passed. Then suddenly a sharp crack split the air. Gunfire, not aimed at him. The soldiers turned, reacting instinctively to the sound. Shouts followed, movement, confusion. The front line was shifting again. Using the chaos, he moved, faster than he had all night. Pain exploded through his body, but adrenaline overpowered it. He crawled, dragged, stumbled forward until his strength finally gave out. He collapsed behind a low ridge and didn't move. For a moment, he was certain this was the end. His vision narrowed, sound faded, the world shrank to his own ragged breathing. Then he heard something that didn't belong. A voice, not enemy. The accent was different, friendly. "Over here!" Hands grabbed his shoulders, rolling him gently onto his back. Faces hovered above him, blurred but unmistakably familiar. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. As medics worked frantically, wrapping him in blankets and administering aid, he allowed his eyes to close, not in surrender, but in relief. Morning had come, and against all odds, he had survived the night. He woke up to white light. At first, he thought he had gone blind. The brightness was overwhelming, painful. He squeezed his eyes shut instinctively, his body reacting before his mind fully caught up. Then came the smells, disinfectant, smoke, blood, oil, a field hospital. The sounds around him were muted but constant, low voices, hurried footsteps, the metallic clink of medical instruments. Somewhere nearby, a man screamed, the sound raw and unfiltered, cutting through everything else. He tried to move. Pain exploded through his leg, sharp and absolute, dragging a gasp from his throat. Immediately, a pair of hands pressed him back down. "Don't move," a voice said firmly. "You're safe now." Safe. The word didn't feel real. As awareness returned, fragments of the night replayed in his mind without warning. Boots in the darkness, the beam of a flashlight inches from his face, the icy water stealing his breath, dogs barking somewhere behind him. His heart raced. A medic noticed the change and leaned closer, speaking slowly, calmly. "You're out of enemy territory. You were picked up just after dawn." He tried to respond, but his throat was dry, his voice barely a whisper. "How long?" The medic hesitated. "You were missing for almost 14 hours. 14 hours. Wounded. Alone. Surrounded." The full weight of it settled in then. His injuries were severe. The leg was fractured in more than one place. Shrapnel had torn through muscle and narrowly missed an artery. Infection was already a concern. He would be evacuated as soon as possible. But what no one treated, what no bandage could cover, was what the night had done to his mind. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was violent. He woke up choking, heart pounding, convinced he was still in the forest. Shadows in the tent made him flinch. Sudden sounds sent his body into instant panic, muscles tensing for a fight that no longer existed. Other soldiers noticed. They had seen it before, men who survived something they shouldn't have. Days later, as he was transported away from the front, an officer visited his bedside. The man asked questions, taking notes, nodding quietly as the story unfolded. At the end, he closed his notebook and looked at him carefully. "You understand," the officer said, "that if you had been found, none of this would have happened." He did understand. That truth stayed with him long after the war moved on without him. He would never return to the front line. His body wouldn't allow it. But the night followed him anyway, into his dreams, into quiet moments, into the rest of his life. When the war finally ended, history moved forward, recording victories, losses, dates, and numbers. But this story never made it into official reports. No one wrote down what it meant to lie wounded in the dark, listening to the enemy walk past you. No one documented the terror of holding your breath while a flashlight passed inches from your face. No record captured the moment a man realized that survival depended not on strength, but on silence. By every measurable standard, he should not have survived. He was wounded, lost, trapped deep behind enemy lines with no support, no communication, and no guarantee that help would ever come. The cold alone should have killed him. The patrol should have found him. The dog should have ended the story before dawn. But survival doesn't always follow logic. Sometimes it follows will. This soldier didn't survive because he was the strongest, the fastest, or the most prepared. He survived because he adapted, because he stayed quiet when noise meant death, moved when stillness became dangerous, and endured pain that would have broken most men. World War II is often remembered through massive battles and famous names, but its true cost and its true stories are found in moments like this, in the hours no one saw, in the men who came back changed, carrying nights they could never forget. He lived. And because he did, this story exists. If you want to hear more true stories of war, survival, and human endurance, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. These are the moments history almost lost, but shouldn't. And remember, sometimes the most powerful victories aren't won on maps or in headlines. They're won in silence, in the dark, by someone who refused to die before morning.